you, everybody, for joining us today with a conversation with Carrie Gleason, who is the director of the Fair Workweek initiative at the Center for Popular Democracy. We are really delighted to have Carrie join us today, and you all should have received a bio for Carrie in your webinar invitation, and Carrie will tell you a little bit more about herself in a bit. But I wanted to quickly go through some housekeeping first. So we are encouraging you to ask questions throughout the webinar, and we are asking for you to type in your questions in the chat box that you see to your left side, to the bottom left side as you're facing your computer. And we will have a couple of moments where we pause during the webinar to take questions, and we will try to address as many questions as possible, and we will communicate those questions to Carrie. So to get started today, like I said, we are really excited to engage in conversation with Carrie today, and we asked Carrie to engage with us today because we know that many of you are exploring new ways to enter into conversation with retail employers about challenges to them and their workers that affect either retention or stability or advancement. And we thought that hearing from Carrie would be helpful because of her deep expertise and understanding of the experience of frontline workers, and also experience with coming up with solutions that can improve the quality of jobs for frontline workers. During today's webinar, Carrie is going to share her perspective on the changing nature of the sector and discuss how she has used her knowledge of the experience of frontline retail workers to conduct conversations with retail employers on the quality of jobs and also on the potential solutions that I just mentioned. And like I said, really, do feel free to type in your questions throughout the webinar. And I think, we are ready to get started. So, Carrie, thanks again for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm pleased to participate today.
Yeah, and I actually just realized that I did not introduce myself, and I should do that. So for those of you who might not know me, I see a lot of familiar names on the line, but for those of you who I have not had the chance to meet, my name is Marcela Montes, and I'm with the Economic Opportunities Program at the Aspen Institute, and I manage the National Reimagine Retail Initiative. Anyways, so sorry about that. But Carrie, we are very delighted for you to join us today. And I wanted to, get started with you and hear a little bit about, your experiences and backgrounds, with the industry. A lot of folks who are on the line are within the workforce sector, and traditionally many who are in the workforce sector have not engaged too much in depth with the retail sector. And we know that you've built, a lot of knowledge around frontline retail staff experiences, and we wanted to hear from you, maybe a description on how you sort of talk to employers about your role relative to retail and the retail workforce, and a little bit of background on your goals for being engaged in the work.
Sure. Well, I can share a little bit about, it might make sense to start what my current work is, and then I think throughout the webinar I'll talk about how I navigate my perch as an advocate and my work actually engaging the industry. So I'm the director of the Fair Workweek initiative. I'm sure many of you have been hearing more and more about the challenges that people face in terms of unpredictable work schedules, the challenges of getting to full-time work. And the Fair Workweek initiative is a part of the Center for Popular Democracy, which is a growing national network of community organizations around the country. And so it's likely that in many of the cities and states where you're doing your work, CPD is a community affiliate that has a membership base of low-income people that could be an organization that you could partner with in terms of your service provision and your programs. But the Fair Workweek initiative has a multi-pronged strategy. We move policy change, industry change. We do strategic research, which I'll talk about today. Some of our success has been through moving cities and states to pass new policies that give service workers more predictable, healthy, balanced work weeks and opportunities for full-time work. So most recently, New York City and Oregon passed comprehensive protections for people in retail and food service that give them more stability in their work weeks. We also move industry change strategies. So, the work to move 12 retail brands to end on-call scheduling was something we worked deeply on. It was a huge industry-wide change that impacted 250,000 people, and many of the brands the Gap, Abercrombie & Fitch, J. Crew. And then we've been doing inside work within the retail sector, working with large retail brands and the workforce management technology vendors, and have been really starting to push a culture change, from the notion of just-in-time scheduling to the idea of employee engagement. And so I'll talk a little bit about that work and about how we engage employers to kind of shift their perspective around their managing their workforce. My roots on this issue come from directing a worker center in New York City called the Retail Action Project. It was a community labor partnership with the Retail Wholesale Department Store Union that represents Macy's, H&M, Zara, Saks Fifth Avenue workers in New York City, and many grocery and pharmacy workers. So New York City is a union town for retail workers. There's not that many of them in the country, but there really is a career ladder in the New York City retail sector where you could work for an employer that is violating your basic wage and hour rights and go up the block and work for an employer that's giving you benefits and where you're earning commissions that give you an income of $100,000 a year. And so part of our strategy was to build a network of retail workers to help people move along the career ladder and lift the floor for everyone else. And so we developed the leadership of retail workers across the sector, engaged them in advocacy and peer-driven services and training. So we started off running one campaign after the next to address the really systemic wage theft and discrimination that the immigrant workforce in Soho is experiencing. We partnered a lot with state attorney general's offices and won over $3.5 million in back wages. And then we also developed a very successful ongoing peer-driven workforce. I'm going to shift to, does that sound better? I know that there is some challenges hearing me. I'm going to hope that it's better. And so we run scaled workforce development programs. So many of our trainers.
Sure, you sound fine. I think we just had a couple of other issues individually, but you're fine.
I'm good. Okay, great. So our trainers are people who've achieved careers in retail, people who are selling high-end shoes at Saks Fifth Avenue, who are selling furniture at Macy's, and they're the trainers in the program that the Retail Action Project runs. And so it's very rooted in the experience of people working in the retail sector, sharing their skills with others who are looking to advance. We also do healthcare enrollment and other kind of networking opportunities. So that's a little bit about me and my work, and now I took the work I did in New York City and have been working more nationally in the last few years. Should I keep going, Marcella?
Oh, sorry. I just realized that I was on mute. I'm sorry. Well, thank you. That was really helpful. I think what would be useful now, because you have had all of these different experiences with the retail sector, first in New York and now at a national level, to get a little bit of your perspective on just the state of the sector in general. We're hearing a lot of conflicting narratives about retail and where it is and shifts in retail and what the implications are for frontline workers. And I know that you've been looking at these issues very closely and have done some research and analysis around it, and we wondered if you'd share your perspective on how you see the sector, especially since your focus really has been on the experience of frontline workers and how frontline workers are being affected by all of these different changes.
Sure. So I think to ground us in the conversation today, it might make sense for us to talk about who is the country's retail workforce. Many of you know it's 1 in 10 people working in the country. About half are women, and 35% are people of color. But it plays out, gender and race plays out really differently depending upon which sector you work in. And all of the disruption that's happening in the retail sector right now is really having a much greater impact on women and people of color. So we'll talk more about that so you can kind of understand within the trends that are happening in the retail, who's kind of feeling it the most. So if you look at just these charts, this is from research that we did of census data, looking at race and gender along the subsectors. So you can see that, women women are more likely to work in clothing stores, health and personal care, and general merchandise. All of the stores that are being hit hard by the rise of e-commerce. And then if you look at race, so I just want you to pay attention to look at general merchandise. It's much lower rates there's much greater percentage of Latino, Black, and Asian workers within general merchandise and also clothing in comparison. And the sectors that are growing, I talked to NPR a lot this year about the disruption in retail, and I kept saying, well, everyone's talking about the retail apocalypse. Retail's still growing. Yes, we lost 100,000 retail jobs, but Home Depot just hired 70,000 people. The more you kind of take a closer look, and you look at the trends on the horizon, there is definitely a lot to be concerned about. So there's a profound disruption happening in retail, and it's having a huge impact on the quality of jobs. It's not just Amazon. It is, increasing corporate concentration right now. Many of the media is talking about the battle between Amazon and Walmart. There's the role of financialization. So Toys R Us is in the press a lot right now because of the bankruptcy that they experienced. But they're owned by private equity firms that have put a lot of pressure on companies like Toys R Us that are struggling with leveraged buyouts. And so, there is this. It's not just the dynamic of e-commerce. It also is the dynamic of investor pressure. And so, if you look at the store closings, it's been devastating. Let me pull up my stats here. So 2017 was just very challenging. Nearly 8,000 retail stores closed. More than 100,000 people lost their jobs. It impacted women, and it impacted people in states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Ohio that are economies that have kind of turned to retail after the factory closed. And so these store closures have been devastating for communities, and we should take them seriously. There's a real urgent need to be there for this workforce that's on the front lines of these changes. And it's not just all companies are created equally. If you look at clothing and department stores, you'll see that those are most of the companies that are closing. And there is this connection between the growth of Amazon and e-commerce and the kinds of pressures that these companies are facing and figuring out how to adapt. If you try to understand, well, what's the impact? Women are feeling these job losses almost entirely. If you look at the bottom, this is the gender breakdown of job growth by between men and women, and you'll see that women working in general merchandise were hit hardest, second to clothing stores. And I think many people think of Amazon as like that's where only men work. Well, the truth is that the Amazon workforce has a lot of women working for, that has a lot of women in the workforce, but it definitely doesn't necessarily match up to where the department store is closing and where Amazon's opening up its distribution centers. So it's a real intense moment, and I think the overall what we're seeing, it's not just e-commerce, it's also automation. So nearly half of the retail workforce is kind of, there are some projections that say nearly half of the retail workforce is going to lose their jobs to robots and other automation. It is not just, again, all subsectors are not going to be impacted equally, and not all jobs are going to be impacted equally. Retail cashiers, they're the lowest paid job in the retail sector no matter where you work. 73% of the workforce are women, and they are definitely going to experience the most job losses. We're already seeing self-checkout take off. And so we're seeing this moment of just like intense competition. I think that there's this debate about between Amazon and Walmart. The truth is Amazon, Walmart still has much higher sales revenues, but Amazon is taking over with market share. And so if you look at the future projections, Amazon's growth rate is 28% since 2008, and Walmart's kind of average sales growth has been about 3%. And so it's just not, the kind of Amazon's rise is something we all need to be thinking about. Their workforce doubled in the last year, and they now employ 541,000 workers, and they are now the second largest retailer in America. And so the rest of the retail industry is feeling this squeeze. They're just trying to figure out how to adapt. This is when you talk to any of these companies about job quality, these are the industry dynamics that every employer is trying to figure out how to navigate. And retail companies are really at a crossroads, right? So there's intensifying market pressure. There are many companies that are both investing in new technology, but also really investing in their workforce and trying to upskill to encourage customers to shop in their stores. And then for the retail workforce, they're now adapting to all these new technologies that are monitoring their work performance, carrying out some of their job duties, delivering training, managing their work schedules. And so there's all this there's both like the kind of need to be omni-channel and also, promote online sales, but also actually navigating technology in the workplace. And so I think that there is really a role for like workforce development providers to play in helping prepare this workforce for the changing nature of work in retail.
Thank you, Carrie. That is really helpful. We actually have a question from Laura Kahn, who's in San Diego with the San Diego Workforce Partnership. Amy, would you like to?
Sure.
Sorry.
So Laura asked Carrie what your sense of in terms of time frame, or what the data say, or what people are saying in terms of the time frame over which people are expected to be losing jobs to automation. How quickly is that happening?
There's a lot of conflicting information on it, and so the truth is there was massive job loss in 2017, but retail still grew in terms of employment, and so we saw within certain subsectors, department stores lost 400,000 jobs, but employment in cashiering went down. But then in home and garden, it went up. And so I think we're going to see these trends play out very inconsistently across both geographies and particular occupations. But it's happening now. The future is now on this stuff. It's not a thing we need to prepare for in the future. It's a thing we need to figure out how to respond to right now.
Thank you.
Thank you. So related to, how we are going to, start thinking about responding, and specifically related to frontline workers, I mean, it's clear that the industry is at a crossroads, like you mentioned. So it would be, helpful to hear about how you, where you are positioned within the retail sector, how you're thinking about it. And we know that you recently, the Center for Popular Democracy recently did a survey on job quality for frontline retail workers. So it would be helpful to hear a little bit more about that survey, what that survey looked like, the types of questions that you asked, and kind of how it fits into all of this that's going on in the sector.
Sure. So last year we surveyed over 1,000 people working in the retail sector. We surveyed both women and men. The survey we did survey women and men and people across race, but we surveyed both frontline employees and managers is what I wanted to say. About 35% of the people that responded to our survey were managers. So we have insights into the career pathways for both frontline workers who are still maybe experiencing barriers, and the people that were able to move up into managerial jobs. And we really worked to make it a representative sample so you can see the percent of the respondents by subsector in this survey. So that's the survey sample at a glance. And what we found was really interesting. I mean, I think a lot of it is what we already know, but I think the census data is generally, the government doesn't collect data on a lot of the problems that people working in retail face in terms of job quality, and there's just not that many representative data sets. And so this was really helpful in terms of having a strong sampling give us insights into the trends. And so some of what we found were things we know. Volatile hours mean volatile incomes. And, part-time employment, 47% of the people that we surveyed were part-time. That's a higher rate than the BLS data shows. We found that the instability in work hours is tremendous. So this shows this is how we calculate instability in terms of hours. So you take the fewest hours you work on average, the greatest hours of work you average, and then you have the usual hours you're working, and the range, right, between the fewest and the greatest. And that gives you the instability ratio. So what we're seeing is from one week, from week to week, part-time workers are seeing their hours fluctuate by 56%. This is month to month. Part-time workers are seeing their hours fluctuate by 56%. And so that's a huge, that means, that's like a day of pay. And so it's pretty significant. If you're working full-time, the variation of your hours is still pretty high. I think what's happening is there's a blurring between working part-time and full-time. If you're full-time, it's not that you just are set, that actually working full-time, you often can dip into part-time hours, but that it does get better. And so when you hear the debate, well, students and women and parents want to work part-time, they're choosing to work part-time, we'll say yes, but look at how unstable it is. This isn't flexibility, this is instability. And it's not easy. And so, and then this isn't, when you similarly look at that part-time workforce, it's for many people who do choose part-time work, they're long-term part-time workers, but they pay a penalty for it. So as we think about the need for equal pay, women are more likely to work part-time, but there's a pay gap. So what we found was part-time workers earn 68 cents for every dollar that a full-time worker makes. And so we looked at the kind of the average pay that we found in this survey was about $13.09, but then the pay gap is consistent between both part-time workers and between women and men. And so when you're thinking about job quality, it's really important to think about how different people in the workforce are impacted by gender, by race, and whether or not they're working full-time or part-time. It really, there's a wide difference within companies. And then so we talked about, well, what matters? What helps you? What do you think matters to get to advancement? And what are the things that matter? And so these were all the things we asked: open availability, training, being able to work a schedule that varies and includes nights and weekends, a positive review from your manager, you have experience, whether or not you meet performance metrics, whether or not you have a degree. These were all the things that mattered. The things that were the two most important metrics in terms of advancement that we found were both open availability, so the ability to work a variable schedule, and training. And so, and then you have scheduling again, being able to work a schedule that varies. And so, this is why we're seeing women not advance in the retail sector. You have to be available you have to be available to work a variable schedule. That's just as much important as getting trained or getting a positive review. It's more important than whether or not you're even meeting your performance metrics. And so really kind of focusing in on how companies approach work schedules, flexibility, stability, pathways to full-time work is really critical to addressing a barrier to advancement. And so this feed, so what we're seeing is that there's actually a lot of mobility.
Carrie, can I interrupt? This, Amy? Before you move on to the next slide, I wonder if we can go back to the other slide and you could maybe give us a little navigation on what the difference is on the two rows. And also, I wondered, is this response about factors that respondents feel affect their ability to advance? Was that all the respondents, or was that only frontline workers or managers? I guess so I'll just ask you that. That's the question.
This was all workers.
Mm-hmm.
So is this just factors that you saw helped them advance? I'm just trying to understand where that comes from.
So the focus, so this is that we surveyed 1,000 people in retail, and we asked you, what do you think matters in terms of advancement? What do you think are the metrics that influence whether or not you'll be able to advance to a better job in your company? And so this is just that people just picked off what they thought mattered.
So they could be responding for what matters to them from their perspective, and also what they see around them for others.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's subjective, right?
Yeah, of course.
But I think it's indicative of what the experience is. People feel a lot of pressure to be able to work a variable open schedule. And I think what we're seeing too, it's noteworthy, right, performance metrics. So, not that many companies are really looking at using performance metrics to promote advancement. They'll maybe use performance metrics to determine if you get a better schedule, maybe a little bit on your raise, but there's a lot of other factors that go into play in terms of whether or not you can advance that are beyond just being a really excellent sales associate.
Mm-hmm. Carrie, this is Maureen. I'm sorry. Can you also just say in terms of how they identified training, because we have training seems really important. So is that training provided by the company versus like college degree or other kind of training or education you might have gotten outside of the company? Or do you know?
Yeah, this is training by the company. So, and we have more data on what training people have received from the company, what training people want from the company, that we'll talk about later. And also we're about to prepare a brief just for workforce development providers like yourselves that kind of dive into, okay, within this sample of workers, what training have they been getting? And there's actually, this workforce is getting, of the people we surveyed, they're getting training and they're excited about training. Like it definitely is a thing that the workforce values.
Great, thank you.
All right.
Great.
I think we're ready to move on. You are, Carrie.
Okay. Cool, yeah, and I'm happy to return to this. It's very rich data in terms of what the perspective is of the frontline workforce. And so what we are finding is that people are moving between jobs, but they're not necessarily moving up. They're going from one job to the next. It's not necessarily a lot of upward mobility. The pathways do exist for sure, but what we're finding is that people are now starting at a lower rung. So part-time is now the entry-level role that workers are able to obtain, and they kind of have to work their way up from part-time to full-time. And that's really the dynamic. A lot of what we hear from workers that we work with is that, well, if I want more hours, I have to open my availability. And that's what I've heard from Kronos, too. If people want more hours, they have to open their availability. And so I've heard the same thing from the industry and from frontline workers. And so it can be really tough for working parents to kind of open their availability to get to that stable full-time job. Of those that we surveyed, is about, of the folks that we surveyed had moved up from frontline to managerial roles. And what we were finding is that within the groups of workers who had experienced mobility, 62% were white. It seems harder for women and people of color to obtain their upward mobility. And then you can see also they had to go through the part-time pathway. 80% had worked part-time. And so I think that this is a challenge. We looked a lot at cross-training too. Cross-training is really viewed as a pathway to greater stability, but definitely it can be, if it's not tied to an explicit career pathway, sometimes it can just be more work without more opportunity. I'm seeing the question, what proportion of people working in retail actually want to work full-time? And the involuntary part-time, I don't know. I feel like I haven't looked at the latest numbers, but it's about Maureen, do you have the latest numbers? I want to say about a third of people working part-time want to work full-time. But those numbers are often wrong because if you say you want to work full-time but then have childcare problems, which is like an official category, then you're like automatically marked as a voluntary part-time worker. We have a report on involuntary. I can send over some resources on part-time work and involuntary part-time employment from both CPD and EPI that I think for folks that are really interested in diving in.
Sure. Yeah, I think that would be great, Carrie. Thank you.
Cool. All right. So in terms of training, this is the employee experience, right? So I'm sure hearing from other employers what they care about. This is interesting, right, because this is what the frontline workforce cares about. So how is employee performance measured? Well, this is what workers had to say. About half says the speed of their work matters, customer reviews, the appearance of the section of their store. Sales per hour really matters in clothing. And clothing also really matters if you're enrolling people in credit cards and pharmacies. It matters if you're enrolling people in the rewards programs. And then it kind of goes down from there. I thought it was really interesting to see the different differences between subsectors. So in general merchandise, it's the speed of your work and the appearance of your store. For home and garden, it's about customer reviews, credit cards. For clothing stores, it's sales per hour and customer emails. And then health store employees is the ability to kind of promote particular products. So I thought it was interesting just in terms of the difference. And then, I think we also, gathered information about what kinds of training people were interested in and where the training happened. And, I'm happy to dive in more into that, and we'll definitely share the brief once it's done. So that's some of the survey findings in a nutshell.
No, that's really helpful, Carrie, and it's really useful information that I think folks could potentially use as they're conducting conversations with employer representatives. I do want to take a quick pause to see if anybody has any other questions. It doesn't seem like folks have questions, but do feel free to type in your questions through the chat as we're coming along. And if you still have questions around the data that Carrie presented, you can ask questions about that, and there will be also opportunities to send in your questions later if you'd like them answered later, or comments about the data that has been presented today. We wanted to give Carrie a chance to present this because it's a good grounding in terms of thinking about how one might approach conversations with employer representatives, and we wanted to switch gears now and mine some of Carrie's experiences actually interfacing with employer representatives and articulating to employers what are some of the conditions that retail workers face and some of the issues that retail workers face and how that can affect their overall productivity and business growth. And Carrie, a lot of the folks who are on the line are really working or planning to work with employers in different ways. And as we mentioned, many of them are in the workforce development space. There are others who are in the community development financial space, for example, and working with small retailers. So folks on the line are trying to engage employers in different ways, and some of them might be doing it in a more individual level of engaging employers, reaching out to a store manager, talking about retention services or placement services. Others might be convening retail employers in their city and providing a forum for retail companies to talk through issues of stability and advancement. So we wondered if we could talk a little bit through how you approach conversations with employers, and as it goes, we can start sort of from the very beginning, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you prepare for these types of conversations with employers, what type of background research you might do, what type of resources you might go to when trying to learn about the industry overall or a particular employer.
Sure. I mean, so I come from my work is always rooted in the frontline experience of the workforce. So I will survey the workforce before I engage an employer. I'll look at their online recruitment strategies. Most of my employer outreach has been through industry vendors, government agencies, direct outreach to companies, and also through other allied organizations. And then I love the National Retail Federation's e-newsletter because they kind of group together all of the big top industry trends. And I found it to be really, really useful to just have a news roundup on what's happening in retail, what the industry thinks matters. And I do think there's so much disruption right now. I mean, I think just Googling news hits on the company that you're talking to, because so many companies are getting hit so hard. And so for a company, if they're on one of the list of companies that are closing stores, maybe improving job quality is going to be a part of their survival strategy. But that's only if it's a part of their survival strategy is going to get the thing that's going to get their attention right now. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about how I approach it.
That's helpful. You talked a little bit about serving workers. Can you say more about that and how you've done that or approached that?
Sure. I mean, so, we do online surveys of workers, some through the Qualtrics survey panels that we did through the survey, which is a bit more rigorous, sometimes through Facebook surveys. That's generally how we'll do it.
I see. So, I mean, I think, preparing for the conversation is an important component of it, but also preparing in a sense where, you're thinking about how you're going to approach and frame how, the company representative that, and you sort of started talking about this when you said, there are some companies that are closing and it will really depend on kind of where they're at. So can you talk a little bit about how you frame yourself as somebody who's working on behalf of workers, and what are some of the things that you think about in preparation and the types of questions that you might ask to open the conversation, and just kind of talk a little bit about kind of how you frame and present yourself to a potential employer contact?
Sure. So I think one thing just to explain why we survey the workforce is that companies often have policies that don't necessarily represent the practice. And so, I think it's important to understand where's that disconnect between the policies that companies feel are important to adopt and the reality of whether or not it's working out in the workforce. And I think what you'll find often is there's some markets that are doing really well and are really delivering, ensuring that their workforce can access earned sick time. And then there's other markets often where, maybe there's other market pressure and the stores are struggling, where maybe it's harder for workers to feel like they can access that benefit. And so it's good to have a handle on it. And so what we've seen also just is that the perspective on job quality can be really different on the corporate level versus across the kind of, if it's from the corporate level to the district manager to the frontline store manager and then down to the workforce. All of those different employee levels of the company will have different perspectives on job quality, so you'll get very different answers depending on who you talk to within the same company. But in terms of how I talk about it, I think a lot of companies are interested in talking with us because we talk to their workforce and they want to know what we're hearing, and they understand that we are committed to making sure that the industry provides good jobs. And so there's some openness to talking. I think we really try to position ourselves to understand that we understand that they have a business to run and that they're doing their best, that they have good intentions, that we all have a shared interest, that we all want employees at their company to do well and thrive and be a part of a successful business. So I think starting off with what we have in common really can help. I try to understand, start off by asking them broad questions to understand what their perspective is and make them feel heard. So, and then that'll give you kind of some guidance of where to kind of get pinpoint concrete challenges, understand what the opportunities are, what are the needs that they have in managing their workforce. So, I think that I'll ask them. It depends on really who you're talking to, right? At the corporate level, I'll say, well, there's so much pressure on the retail sector right now. How is that changing how you approach engaging your workforce? How's the company thinking about investing in training versus, maybe some places of automation? And so I try to root the bigger kind of global questions and how is the company looking to adapt in this moment? Because I think starting off there will show that you understand what the industry is experiencing right now, and it's really hard. I have a lot of sympathy for what America's retail brands are going through right now. It's a tough landscape, and it's volatile. So you talk to the folks at Deloitte, and they'll just be you have no idea how this is going to shake out. It's a lot of everyone is operating in this unknown territory. So companies, you're not going to see every company make the same decision on how they adapt. But if you're kind of in the level where you're with a district manager or you're with the person that's in charge of thinking about, policies around recruitment and employee management, you should understand how do they measure performance? What are they looking for in terms of recruitment? Are they feeling like they're able to find enough employees and enough people with the skills and talents they need to meet their business goals? Understanding how they approach hiring and training and advancement. What are the things that they look for in terms of measuring whether or not their frontline managers are achieving the metrics on employee engagement and performance? A lot of companies are really investing in new technology to measure employee engagement, and they do pulse surveys to understand if new strategies are actually working in terms of improving company morale. They don't want their workforce talking to the New York Times. They want their workforce talking to them about what are the problems. And so what we're seeing is that there's this culture now within the retail sector of really trying to be responsive to what's not working for employees. So I think that kind of now more than ever, there's an awareness from companies about what their experience of their frontline workforce is. But that's kind of some of how I navigate it. I think about it more in terms of how are they adapting to this moment. A lot of companies really are in flux.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, it's really just, I really liked your frame of seeking common ground and, making them feel heard and comfortable. And some of these topics can be quite difficult to address, and especially the ones around stability and job quality. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more.
Can I ask a follow-up before you move on?
Sure.
Okay, Carrie, this is Amy. When you were talking about companies doing pulse surveys and trying to get a handle on what their employees are thinking and responding to the types of things they were doing to improve employee engagement. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of the kinds of things you are seeing that employers are doing with their workforce to work on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely there's technologies around. A lot of companies are trying to integrate mobile apps in terms of workforce scheduling, so people can manage their schedule on their phone. We found that actually we surveyed people. Of the workforce that we surveyed, almost everyone had access to Wi-Fi at home on their phones, and 43% use their phone to manage their schedule. which I just thought, like, oh, my God, 5 years ago that number would not have been that high. There's just this, like, movement where the workforce really is feeling empowered to manage their schedule through the technologies that the company is promoting. So I think that's really evolved. Like, it used to be that people use Facebook groups where employees would trade shifts between themselves on independent Facebook groups, and now companies are kind of folding that into their workforce management technologies and allowing people to trade shifts more easily. So I think that's one way. I think people will, like, ask how people feel through these pulse surveys and through these apps more. And then there's just, like, added bonuses and benefits. Like, Starbucks is probably the best company to look at in terms of, like, what strategies they're using to kind of boost employee morale and engagement.
Mm-hmm.
They're always, like, Spotify, and they're always adding these new creative benefits.
Like subscriptions to Spotify?
Yeah, you can, if you're a Starbucks barista, you can get a subscription to Spotify.
Okay, thanks. Do you find that employers are doing their own surveys, but you're surveying too? When you go in and you've talked to a retail company's workers, are they interested in what you're hearing, or do you share that?
I don't always share it. No, I mean I think it's I don't always share it. Sometimes we make it public. And like with Starbucks, after they announced their policy change, we did do a survey of their workforce to whether or not they were complying with it, and did make it public. I think it depends, on what feels most useful in terms of building the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's helpful information because I think also knowing what are some of the things and practices and policies are actually helping employees have a good workplace and be engaged and want to come to work can be quite useful to know as you're also trying to figure out what are some of the issues that are not helping workers be successful in their jobs, and having those conversations can be hard. And we wondered if you had some insight on how you do approach some of those more sensitive conversations around wages and instability and scheduling, because obviously it does seem to be an issue for folks, and it's an issue that I think, as you mentioned earlier, can get in the way of people accessing training or even figuring out how to access advancement opportunities within the company. So we wondered if you could say a little something about that.
Sure. I think overall, there's this industry trend to raise wages, right? Walmart just had that huge announcement to provide paid family leave for full-time associates and to raise wages again. And, we're seeing this across the board within the retail sector. I think that's moving more retail companies to follow suit. And so I think there's this moment where it's actually pretty easy to go talk to a company and say, wow, we heard about that announcement. That's amazing, right? Like, that's giving somebody paid family leave is way better than Spotify. I think that, like, there's been this, like, moment where actually companies are really taking bold measures in terms of things that really matter for workers, like wages and benefits, and whether or not they have a schedule that enables them to be there with their family. So I think that there's a way to kind of talk about it. I think a strategic thing you could do is if you're not talking to one of those, to talk to the company, are they one of the companies that have made a new bold policy announcement, or are they maybe a company that's a competitor to that company, right? Saying, wow, I see, if you're talking to Kohl's and you see, wow, I see Target and Walmart are raising their wages. Is that something Kohl's is considering doing? I think that that's a serious conversation that you could have, because there is a discussion right now in Kohl's to decide if they should raise wages. Like, they're competing with these other companies for the same workers. So I think on that corporate level, I think you can. They all know the debate, and they're all thinking about where they make the investments in terms of wages, and especially now with the recent tax bill, like a lot of companies now are actually looking to are putting that back in the workforce. And so I think now is a good moment to say, what's the company looking at for the next 5 years in terms of wages? Like, that's a real question you can just outright ask. without making the company feel defensive, because there are so many big brands that are actually already doing it. But I think when you get to kind of the district level manager, where they're not deciding whether or not their company provides paid family leave. It is like completely out of their control, but they do control workforce management. They can make a lot of decisions that impact turnover. And so when you talk to them about, well, what are the challenges they're facing with their workforce, they might say turnover. That's like a thing that retail companies really do feel stressed about. And you can ask them, well, what do you think is causing that turnover? What do they think is the root cause? And some of them feel frustrated. Well, I think we're not paying enough, but I can't do anything about it. Well, how are work schedules? How are you thinking about that? And they may not feel like they have the ability or know where to go in terms of how to change the workforce, the scheduling policies, and that's something that there's actually a lot of opportunities for them to get technical resources to think about how to maybe adapt their scheduling to offer more stability, kind of hold managers accountable to not making last-minute changes, to not making edits on their software. And that's the industry language. Editing the schedule is code word for last-minute schedules for retail workers, right? And so you can say, well, like, how often are your managers editing the schedule that the company's producing? And they'll have that information, and it's a way to kind of speak their language and understand, well, like, wow, why don't you see if you can kind of move your managers to stop editing the schedule and start to be more, accommodate people's requests a little bit more. Like, try it out, and you might see that might have a positive impact on turnover. So there's a way to kind of co-conspire with them to try different things out, and to not say, like, okay, you have to change everything right now. But I don't know, is there a store where you feel like you might have a manager that might be able to, like, pilot something with you to try a different approach and see if that helps with turnover? So I think there's, like, an opportunity there. I mean, it depends on if you find someone who's really open to talking. Having a champion within the company is really, really helpful for moving the bigger company. All of these companies that are making changes had champions that were able to move the policy change throughout the organization. I think the other end of it is, like, there's more and more industry research that shows the business case for better jobs. Aspen's at the forefront of that. I think sharing some of that can be helpful. I think some folks they might really respond to it, but I think it can be helpful just to so that there's, like, data behind making these kinds of changes.
No, thank you. We do have one question from Laura from San Diego, and they're working with more of the small non-national retailer companies, and she was wondering if you have any insight or suggestions on how to approach these same topics with those companies. Is it different? Are there things that people should consider?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends upon what kinds of companies you're dealing with within that end of it. So I've seen both sometimes that, smaller non-national retailers mean that they're more like boutique companies that really are more family businesses that can do a lot in terms of job quality and can be much better places to work, and it's easier to move changes within how the company operates. What I've seen, though, in terms of, like, what I talked about in terms of the retail action projects, most of those wage theft campaigns were with, regional chains that were super profitable that weren't following wage and hour laws. And so that's just something to be mindful of if you, to keep your eye out in terms of, how does the company approach it? Is it more of like high road? Our workforce is our family? These are all the things we're doing concretely versus companies that are really just operating at a tighter margin and trying to skirt the law.
Great. That's really helpful. So I want to be mindful of our time. We have about 5 minutes left, and I wonder if anybody else on the line has questions. I know that the folks who are just dialing in on the phone can raise their hands, and we can call on them. Folks who are on the web cannot do that. They have to type in their question.
I have a question.
Sure.
Carrie, this is Ternita from Aspen. I have one small question for you. I think it's small, but I was wondering, when you survey workers, you connect with them, do you see any differences between their perspectives if they work for a national big box chain versus like a smaller retailer in terms of the issues that they're bumping up against in work?
Yeah, there's definitely a difference. We surveyed only people from large corporate retailers, and yeah, there's definitely always a difference. There's not as much a problem with part-time work with smaller chains.
How about anything that's training related? Did they ever mention anything about anything that they would like or to think or they think would be helpful for them in terms of training that would be provided by their employer?
Yeah. Do you mean in the difference between corporate versus smaller chains or overall?
Corporate versus smaller chains.
Yeah, I've worked with a lot of people who work for regional chains, and I think the training is much more just hands-on with store-based managers, and it's really about the manager. There's a lot more opportunities for workers to be empowered to do more in the store and advance more quickly, I've seen. So most of the managers are people who started off as sales or stock associates, so the career ladder is a lot faster, and it's easier to achieve. I do think within like, I think you would not, there's not like formal trainings though in those types of places. It was interesting, we surveyed people what they wanted in terms of trainings from corporate retailers, and 36% said manager training. Like, people really they want to know what the pathway is and what they have to do to advance. But then similarly, learning about the products and merchandise, learning about customer service, store operations, it was all 32 to 35% rates in terms of what people were interested in. So I think workers really just on the front line of the store, of corporate stores, want to know more. They want to be more involved. They want to have more support in learning about the products and merchandise. They don't want to have the experience of telling people to have to look on the internet to answer folks' questions. And they want to understand kind of what moves store operations so that they can be a part of making them better.
That's helpful. Thank you. Yeah. Carrie, I kind of want to ask this, Maureen, and I just want to ask sort of a basic question. Like, so if there's a company that you want to contact and talk to them about their work issues and you don't already sort of know somebody, I mean, I'm just curious do you just walk into the store and try to find the manager? Do you find somebody's email or phone number? Do you get somebody to introduce you? Like how do you go about figuring out that initial contact?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends upon what is your goal, right? So if it's job placements, you can just go and say, can I speak to the store manager? I want to partner on job placements, and you don't need to go to even the district manager to do that. I think if it's about job quality, it is on the corporate level. And so, yeah, it's mapping relationships that I have in the industry or with other advocates to say who knows somebody from this company because we'd like to engage them. That's usually the way that I go, is try to find someone who knows somebody. That's, I think in terms of like regional markets, a lot of, I'm sure many on the phone know, like there's these, in New York City, for example, there's the one-stop workforce centers, and they have lots of partnerships with retail companies, and so the Retail Action Project will engage them and connect with companies through that system.
Yeah. So I'm curious if you've worked with anybody who, because I can imagine sort of your first goal is maybe job placement, but then, if the company's having a problem with turnover, then you also, as the person placing people in jobs, are having a problem with turnover, right? So then you want to say, well, how do we have a conversation about editing schedules or something else? Do you try to work with, like, that store manager to try to engage the district manager? Or, like, how would you envision that working out for somebody?
Yeah, I mean, I think finding the store manager is willing to connect with the district manager is a good pathway if you can't get to the district manager. I mean, I think it's okay to cold call people. everyone is coming from very well-regarded institutions, they should want to connect and form partnerships. So I think that's okay too. Yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead. Well, thank you. No, we're actually out of time, a little bit over, so apologies for that. This has been really interesting. Thank you, Carrie, for taking the time today to share your perspective and knowledge with us. And we will be having a couple more webinars coming up. They will be with Sarah Kallick from the Good Jobs Institute, and they will be focused on turnover. So we'll be sending more information on those in the next week or so. But thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and we'll hope to talk to all of you soon again.
Right. Thanks,
everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Carrie.